Okay, well, welcome. And first of all, a heartfelt thanks to the organising committee for this wonderful meeting. It is a real privilege to be able to present to you today. We've had so many wonderful and interesting talks already. I just hope that you will find mine half as interesting as I found those that have gone before me. After Victor's wonderful, broad-ranging theoretical discussion, I regrettably returned to a much more empirically based presentation, but I hope you'll find it interesting. So what I'm looking at here is how a series of experiments evaluating the limits of unconscious learning might help us test theories of consciousness. I'm presenting just one series of experiments that I've conducted. It's taken a number of years to get there, but I'm hoping you'll see that this at least was a productive way forward. So there are many different theories of consciousness. I haven't nearly enough time to discuss the different theories and compare them. They can very broadly be split into two groups, the higher order theories and then integrative theories. Integrative theories include things like the global workspace theory, multiple drafts, integrated information theory, and so on. I'm going to look specifically at the global workspace theory, and the target of this research was to say, okay, is there a way of testing this to see if there's any means to falsify the claims that the theory makes, or the central claim that it makes? So, global workspace theory. The idea here is that essentially all of our senses, our sight, sounds, touch, first presented in small localized, represented rather, in small localized regions of the cortex. And those senses that are unconscious, those experiences that are unconscious, are those that are remaining within those localized areas. Conscious experiences are those that get broadcast globally. So they enter this wider network of connections much more broadly across the whole cortex. And that really is the essence of this theory. Now, there are some quite key implications of that, one of which is that learning that's dependent on the broadcast to that wider network should be conscious. So it shouldn't be possible to achieve learning where there's senses, disparate regions, so where material is presented to disparate regions of the cortex, and you need to build connections between them. Sorry. Okay. It shouldn't be possible to achieve that kind of learning without conscious awareness. Does this make sense? So specifically, consciousness is needed to integrate multiple sensory inputs. So if you are hearing something, so that is being processed within your auditory cortex, and you're seeing something being processed in your visual cortex, in order to build an association between those senses, that material needs to enter the global workspace. So that's illustrated here with localized representations like these in grey, being separate and unconscious, and only those, when they become connected in to the global workspace, like here, does it become conscious. So the key point here is it should not be possible to build an association between two sensory inputs in different modalities, i.e. presented in very different parts of the cortex. Shouldn't be possible to build an association between them without those two stimuli being conscious, i.e. without them being represented within the global workspace. So if they're in separate regions like this, it shouldn't be possible to build an association. That was the target of our interest here. This is essentially a particular assumption of global workspace theory. It extends to a lot of others as well. This global availability is what represents consciousness, or what is consciousness, this global availability. So I set about with a target to examine whether this cross-modal association could be built with stimuli that are subliminal, so unconscious, so they're not consciously perceived. That was the goal. Now, to look at a little bit of the background, as I'm not going to go into the detail of this work, unfortunately I probably won't have time, but what has been shown previously is that people can build associations without conscious awareness. So this is within single modalities. So for example, the visual presentation of just to take one at random, subliminal faces and written professions. You'll see that I've taken some inspiration from that study. So that just the faces and the written professions, both within the visual domain, had been shown to be associated even when both aspects were subliminal. So we're able to do that with subliminal stimuli. We're able to build that association. And that was one particular study that Duss et al. Had demonstrated. What's also been shown, is that you can achieve unconscious cross-modal priming. So you can present material in one modality that primes responses in another. This has got less evidence for it, but there has been some success with it. Lamy et al. Found that cross-modal priming from auditory to visual stimuli was effective. So we've got that, but that doesn't present a real challenge to the global workspace theory, because it doesn't present an association from disparate regions. There has, however, been cross-modal associative learning in sleep. Now, this is a fascinating study by Ars et al. In 2012. I'll just give you a little bit of detail on it. So here, they paired tones with either pleasant or unpleasant odours during sleep. So the person is fast asleep, they present a tone, and they present an odour that's either pleasant or unpleasant. And they have different tones for different odours. And what they were able to measure is the depth of intake of breath. So they breathe in more when it's a pleasant smell. And over time, they showed that the person breathes deeper on the presentation of the tone paired with the pleasant smell. So they're learning that tone predicts a pleasant smell, and they take a deeper breath. This continues through the night. So when you present tones later in the night, sure enough, you get this response. But it also continues into waking as well. Now this is really exciting. It's been very hard to show any real learning taking place within sleep. I mean, all of my students would love that to be the case. I'll nod off in the middle of lectures and hope to take it in that way. It doesn't work, sadly. Not unless you're learning just a simple association between a tone and a pleasant or unpleasant smell. But this work here did show this rather reliable effect. But the question is this in any way a challenge to global workspace theory? So why did I bother with my research if this is already out there? Well, the simple fact is it doesn't. And the reason it doesn't is that within sleep, although we refer to being conscious or unconscious, being asleep, being awake, that sleep state doesn't preclude conscious states. So in your dream states, and even in non-dream, in non-REM states, you still have conscious representations. Now this doesn't even need to be, but includes lucid dream states, where you're aware of dreaming, for example. But even in non-lucid dreams, you're still having conscious experiences in terms of the content with it, representation. So there's a key difference here between the representation with mind and being asleep versus awake. So what we're interested in is whether there's conscious state of representation, so being aware of holding that representation, of experiencing something. Now obviously in sleep you might think of many, many different reasons why that's quite different to being awake, but nonetheless you do have these experiences. So there was still remained a key important question is whether this existed within a waking state. Plus of course within a waking state you can reliably preclude the existence of any conscious experience of the individual stimuli. So that's why we didn't stop at that point when we heard about this research. So what did we do? So what was our approach to this series of experiments? The first thing, we wanted to adopt a linguistic paradigm. This is quite practical, it's just pragmatic. We wanted something where the stimuli are extremely well represented, so you've got some strong representation. We know that it's much easier to build associations between stimuli for which you have a strong representation. So linguistic stimuli make sense. It also meant that we could look at a task that could be done visually with writing and auditorily with words. So simply based on those reasons. We wanted to use reaction times as a dependent variable. And again, this was just pragmatism. Many previous studies have shown effects in the reaction time response which have been failed to be shown in the classification response. So to take one example, Atas et al. Is an unconscious implicit learning experiment which showed associations in people's response time. So in this particular case, it was a study linking a particular sequence of unconsciously presented symbols, some of which were rewarded and some of which were not. Now, their reaction time to endorse the rewarded stimuli was faster, so it demonstrated reliable learning, but they didn't endorse the rewarded sequence more often than the unrewarded. So their endorsement judgments didn't show the learning, but the reaction times did. This has been true in a number of other studies. So again, pragmatism here, we just chose the measure that would give us the greatest chance of actually identifying something. We wanted a trial-by-trial test of awareness. Now, this is for lots of reasons, but it avoids issues of drifting thresholds. So we're looking to subliminally present something subliminally. We want to get as close to that subliminal threshold as we can. So just below the point where you're able to consciously perceive it, because we like to get maximum effect, but we want to know that it is below that threshold. Now, if we do a trial-by-trial test, we can be right on the verge of that and just exclude those trials where it popped into awareness. So you're going to get some variation. And on those trials, we can just exclude them. So again, just for sensitivity, really. And it also, it enables us to exclude them, which means that we can reliably state these were unconscious because people weren't able to report them, but also we can get as close to that threshold as possible. So initially, we adopted a 3-study sequence. We've then gone on and done a couple more studies, which I'll present today. But the initial sequence, the idea was simply, let's show that we can get unconscious associative learning in one modality, and then show that we can do it in a second modality, and then move to the real test, which is, can we do this cross-modally, where all the stimuli are subliminal? Now, actually, it took quite a number of years before we managed to get effective associative learning, even in a single modality. It proved to be a great task. Once we finally got it, obviously we continued to replicate, so that's been very useful. But it took a long time, a lot of frustration. The key thing here is if we are able to show associative learning in each modality independently, then when we came to that third study, it didn't matter what the result would be. Because if we were able to show that you couldn't do it cross-modally, then that would be an interesting result. If you could, then equally, that would challenge the theory and would also be very interesting as well. But the key thing is to set it up with those two. So, what was our first study? Now, I apologize, the detail, this is quite a complex design, but if you're able to concentrate through the first one, it'll be much easier after that, because there's pretty much the same design for each of the subsequent studies. So I'll take you through it systematically. First thing is the pre-stages. So we find the individual's auditory threshold. Now this is done just simply subjectively. In this case, for this particular study, we were just presenting a series of random numbers with a word, a non-number word, presented in there. So you would listen, you would hear 1, 3, 7, yellow, 2, 4, 6, that sort of thing. Now the point there was we just kept reducing the volume until they could no longer report whether there had been a non-number word present or not. Once they reached that point, we're taking that as their subjective threshold. Obviously, we had a number of trials at that point to be sure that they had reached it. We then introduced an attentional task, and this was really to try and keep them focused. So here, the attentional task was we presented this sequence, as I've just described, to one ear, and in the other ear we presented a random sequence of 1 and 2s, and they had to literally press the button 1 when they heard the number 1, and the button 2 when they heard the number 2 in the other ear. This was part of the early study in order to try and sort of increase the chances that they weren't ever going to actually detect something that we were wanting to be subliminal, so focusing their attention on the other ear. We then had them classify a set of professions. Now there were 8 what we called creative professions and 8 non-creative. So the creative professions were anything to do with art or music. So there may have been guitarist, musician, painter, and 8 which we deemed to be uncreative, which include things like banker, plumber. I think accountant was in there, which you might imagine that you have a creative accountant. It's probably a good thing, but you probably don't ever want a creative plumber. But these simply were two lists of words, and we just had them classify them in order so they were practiced. So whenever they saw the profession, they knew, yes, this is classified as a creative or an uncreative profession, just to practice that process. So that was all preparation for the test phase. And there are only 32 trials, 3 stages per trial. And this is where it gets a little bit complicated. So in the first stage, there are 2 name profession pairs presented auditorily. So like this, they're hearing, again, buried in this series of numbers, they're hearing the name Mike and the profession pianist, and that'd be repeated twice. And then they'd hear the name Paul, followed by banker, repeated twice, all the time while doing the attentional task based on the supraliminal presentation of the numbers in the other ear. So Mike and pianist and Paul and banker is all below their threshold of awareness, and in the other ear they're hearing supraliminally 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, and classifying. So this is the subliminal presentation stage. Then they're asked to report whether they heard any non-number words at all. Okay, so this is our trial-by-trial test awareness. So if they did hear any non-number words at that stage, that trial's excluded in the analysis. Now this is the key bit. This is the test phase. So immediately after, so we do this trial by trial. So they'll hear these pairs, just 2 pairs, and then they'll move on, provided they didn't actually hear any of them consciously, to the test phase. And there'll be one of two arrangements. One is what we call the concordant, where they'll hear supraliminally now, they will hear the name, Mike, and then they know that they're told at that point, because they've never heard any names up until this point consciously, they're going to be told they're going to hear a name, but it's like, just ignore the name, you don't have to pay any attention to that, but as soon as you hear the profession, we want you to classify it as you've been trained. So classify the profession as creative or uncreative. So just that reaction time, that was our dependent variable. And what we're looking at was the effect of whether we paired Mike with pianist, which would have been a concordant with their subliminal presentation, or paired Mike with banker, in this case, being discordant with the subliminal presentation. So that was the setup. So how do we get on with that? First thing I want to cover is our exclusion criteria. So we're living in a time when there's an awful lot of focus on replicability of studies, which is a very good thing, I think. Working within cognitive psychology and using behavioral studies, we have a lot less analytical flexibility than some paradigms like fMRI, where unfortunately they have far too much flexibility. But nonetheless, we can be subject to it ourselves. We can choose to analyze it one way on one occasion and a slightly different way the next time. And this is a problem for us, and it's a problem for replication. So what I'm telling you here is the exclusion criteria that were applied to all of the studies. So all the studies I'm presenting, we applied the same criteria. I think that's kind of crucial to the good science, if you like. So the first thing we did is any trial where the subliminal word was identified, they said I could hear the word. Anywhere the classification judgment was wrong, so if they pressed creative when it was an uncreative word, those trials were excluded as well. And anywhere the reaction time was either too short to reflect a decision process, less than 200 milliseconds, or more than 2 standard deviations from their particular mean, just standard exclusion of outliers. Participants were excluded if they perceived words on more than 25% of the trials. That was simply a case of, well, if they're hearing too many of these, then we can't feel that we've reliably identified their threshold, so they will be excluded on that basis. And if their reaction time difference as a whole, the difference between the reaction times for concordant and discordant, was identified as an outlier across participants. So just standard exclusion of outliering participants. So what did we see? Well, I guess I wouldn't be here if it didn't turn out like this, or something like this. So what you're looking at there is we've got a significant difference. It's not huge in terms of reaction times, as you can see, 14 milliseconds. It's not great. Effect size is pretty small, 0.37. Crucially, it's not in the direction we would have predicted either. So I'm going to come clean. Right from the start, we would have predicted that you were going to have shorter reaction times for concordant pairings. Yes, that was predictable. It turned out the other way around. Now, if I was just presenting one experiment, I'd be a bit embarrassed at this point, but I can tell you that this pattern replicates through the whole series of experiments. So I take that to indicate that this is a reliable result and tells us that they are learning. I can't give you a full explanation for why the pattern's that way round. We think it might be related to this incompatibility effects that you get, but it is subject to discussion, and I really don't know enough about it. I mean, it's something we're exploring at the moment. So this was great news. So we had unconscious associative learning in the auditory paradigm, step 1. So step 2, we need to do the same thing in a second single modality so that we can then examine subsequently whether we can go between the two. So experiment 2 gets easier now because it's pretty much the same setup. So 3 stages. Here we're presenting words. Basically what we're doing is we're just shortening the duration that the word is present. What we actually use is a low contrast word. So we have it in sort of dark grey on a light grey background. That enables it to be a much longer exposure time and still be below threshold. So essentially what happens is they're presented with a word. We reduce that time frame until they can no longer identify the word. So essentially just a thresholding task, again using a subliminal threshold. If my recall is correct, essentially we wait until the point where they say they couldn't identify the word 8 times in a row. So at that point we say that was their threshold. We then introduce an attentional task, much like that numbers task. Here we're just using arrows because this is all visually based. So what they now do is we have exactly the same sequence. The words are still there, and they have the arrows appear randomly to the left or the right. So the word is now subliminal. The arrow is there for something like 600 milliseconds, so they respond to the arrows, and they're encouraged to do that. This means that they're obviously attentionally focused on the region where the word's being presented. And again, in any of these trials, if they do identify afterwards that there's a word, we further reduce the threshold. So we identify the threshold in the first stage, further refine it if necessary in the subsequent stage. And then again, we train them on this classification task. So now the words are being presented visually, these professions. So pianist and plumber, and you're classifying them as being creative or uncreative, just to get that reaction time trained. So same as before. So now, test phase, pretty much exactly the same as before, but everything's being visually presented. So you've got repetitions of the pairs and this sort of time frames. So you're seeing Mike and pianist here, and then Paul and banker, and these are just being visually presented but below your threshold of awareness. Again, you're reporting if you could detect any of these words. And then moving on to the test, where essentially at this point, it's the first time they're conscious of seeing any names. And we say, okay, we're going to present, you're going to see a name, and then very shortly afterwards you're going to see a profession, and we want you to classify the profession. You can ignore the name. And we're seeing how much the concordance versus discordance affected the reaction times, exactly as before. So here, Mike and pianist, or Mike versus banker. Now, just to emphasize, exclusion criteria exactly the same as experiment 1. And what do we get? Very much the same result. So, as I say, I was delighted at this stage, because this is the point where we knew that we could publish the work. It didn't matter what happened after this, because if we can't find cross-modal binding unconsciously, then that's a result. And if we do, that's a result. So we're really happy at this stage. This was the celebratory point. So we had this result, very much the same sort of size this time, a little bit bigger in terms of reaction times, 21 milliseconds. Something I should point out, something I haven't mentioned here is, in all of these studies, the other thing that's applied to all of them is we reciprocate the reaction time to normalize the distribution. So we reciprocated it. I've converted it back to reaction times here. So sometimes you'll see that the scale is slightly non-linear. That's just because of the reciprocation. But essentially, this is the difference in reaction times. We get the same direction. As I say, don't fully understand why it's that direction, but it's a reliable effect. So that was great news. So now we can do the real test. We can say, okay, can we do this unconsciously? So the linguistic cross-modal. So pre-stages, now it's very much the same as before. So we find the auditory threshold in the same way as before. We find the visual threshold in exactly the same way as before. We then combine the visual and auditory with an attentional task. The attentional task, we just use the visual one. So essentially, they're now hearing subliminal presentations of words, they're seeing subliminal presentations of the professions, and they're seeing supraliminal arrows, left and right, and they're just responding to those. Okay? And then the trained, once again, on classifying the professions. The professions are presented visually, so the names are presented auditorily and the professions visually. So just exactly the same training as in the previous study. And 32 test trials. So now you're seeing this sort of arrangement. So I'm hearing Mike, and then, well, subliminally being presented Mike through the headphones, and then subliminally seeing very soon afterwards the word pianist on the screen, and that is being repeated twice, and then I'm getting two presentations of Paul through the headphones and banker on the screen. So these two pairs are being presented once again. And again, if they saw or heard any stimuli, that's made a note and they're excluded from the analysis. And then the test phase, obviously key. So here we're presenting Mike auditorily and pianist visually, so this would be a concordant trial, or Mike auditorily and banker visually, a discordant trial. Obviously the opposite pair is also included in the total set of tests. So once again, to emphasize, exactly the same exclusion criteria. There's no shenanigans with the analysis. And that's what we got. So this was delightful. This really came and said, okay, we can place a challenge at global workspace theory in terms of saying, okay, you can learn associations between disparate modalities which are being represented in different areas of the cortex, distinct areas, without it being within the global workspace. So this was a fascinating result for us, a great day. This is the summary of that work to that point. So these are the three studies. It never comes out like this, does it? I mean, I have to put my hand up. This was the end of about 5 years of trying to get here. So it wasn't a simple one-off study where we got lucky. It took a while before we got the unconscious associative learning. But this was wonderful. Similar effect size across them, all relatively small. This is why there was typically 60 participants. Well, in all these studies, 60 participants run, so had a reasonable amount of power within subject with 60 participants. But of course, as with all good research, well, I hope it's good, but as with all research, it inevitably throws up more questions than it does give us answers. And in this case, we had a couple of really key questions. One is, might these findings be limited to the linguistic stimuli? So the problem with using linguistic stimuli that I didn't think about initially was quite simply that since a very young age, you've been learning this association between a visual representation and a phonetic representation. You can't read without hearing it, pretty much. Maybe if you're particularly good at reading, but generally, we see a word, we hear it. And of course, that undermines our claims to some extent, because those even subliminal presentations of words could be eliciting a phonological representation, and therefore the association between the auditory representation could be between the auditory representation and the phonetically generated auditory representation of the visual word. So there was a possible limitation to our finding there. And I had no issue with that. I felt the results were interesting anyway, but it certainly would be an obvious follow-on to do, so we felt we had to do that. Second question, which is, can we do this, if we can do this unconsciously, what about this all definitional in terms of human nature, this all-powerful, almost definitional quality of consciousness? What is that going to bring to it? What kind of size of effect would we observe if we did this consciously versus unconsciously? So that seems an obvious thing that we should follow on. And it's literally just in the last couple of weeks that I've got the data from both of these studies, so I'll go on to present those for you. So the non-linguistic cross-modal. As I said, I had very little expectation for this particular one, for lots of reasons. One, I was persuaded that actually this could be just down to the fact that we had this really overlearnt association between visual and auditory using words. But also, if you think about it, anything that you're familiar with, you give a name to it. And therefore, to try and try to create stimuli that don't have a name, they have to be unfamiliar. And building an association between unfamiliar things is much, much more difficult. This is common, it's represented in lots of theoretical models. Even the ACT memory model will say this. The strength of the representation dictates how easy it is to build associations between it and something else. So I felt that that was going to limit us. Nonetheless, we had to try it. So what did we choose for our stimuli? So we had to find the auditory threshold, and what we used for the stimuli here were just sequences of tones. So just 4 tones, just random sequences of 4 tones. So I'm hoping that none of these were so representational that anyone would have a name for them. So they'd hear these sequences of tones, and we'd reduce, again, the volume. Now in this case, because tones are much more easily discerned, what we used, instead of having them just drop below the point where people could hear them, we had a white noise as well. So they were white noise masked. So initially you'd hear the same volume white noise and the tones, and then we'd reduce down the volume of the tones until the point where they couldn't tell whether the last 2 tones were the same or different. That was the question that we presented to find that threshold. So once they got to the point where they could no longer tell whether the last 2 of the sequence of 4 tones was the same or different, and they reported that in 8 consecutive trials, we took that to be their auditory threshold. Find their visual threshold. Now this is obviously the same process as before, but this time what we're using is just random sequences of these sort of symbols. So here's sort of like the less than sign and the forward slash, but random sequences of them. So it wasn't just a single symbol, which you may well have a verbal representation for, but it was a sequence of them. And what we were asking them to say is this sequence symmetrical or asymmetrical? So lots of these, and bringing down the threshold until, again, they couldn't make that distinction. Then combining them in the same way as before with the attentional task of the arrows, the left and right arrows. And of course, again, if they were able to hear or were able to see, we further reduced the threshold, the relevant threshold. And then again, training. So here, instead of training on professions, we're training them on sequences of symbol strings like this. So this sequence string here, the symbol strings rather, is asymmetrical obviously, and this one's symmetrical. And we literally just had 8 asymmetrical ones, 8 symmetrical ones, and got them to classify them. Really quite simple. And that's equivalent to the classification of the professions. A little easier maybe. So, 32 trials. Again, so now we're hearing, or subliminally presenting the auditory tone sequences, subliminally presenting the symbol sequences, and then doing the same thing twice, and then a different tone sequence and different symbol sequence. And again, excluding any trials where they're able to distinguish these. There's actually very few by this point. And then for the test phase, exactly the same as before. So we take the concordant pairing, and we present the tones now supraliminally, and then we present the symbol sequence and ask them to classify it as symmetrical or asymmetrical. And then we take perhaps the same one and the opposite, as in the symbol sequence that was paired with the other tone sequence subliminally, and that's the discordant trial. So exactly the same. Once again, I'm repeating myself, but exactly the same exclusion criteria applied, and that's what we got. It didn't get to 2-tailed significance, it got 1-tailed, but I felt, to be honest, in the context of the previous studies, I was pretty chuffed with that. It was a surprise to me, as I say. The mean difference here is 9 milliseconds. We actually fell short a little bit on the number of participants. My project student had a great deal of challenges. We tried a different approach before, actually, and that had failed, so we were running out of time. So we ran 56 participants in this case. There were quite a few exclusions based on these criteria. It actually brought it down to 49, which may be why we're at this 1-tailed significance. But the effect size is slightly smaller, but I don't think that would stand up to any significant comparison. The effect was there, so quite surprisingly. So this really does strengthen our case that this main feature of the global workspace theory can be challenged. We can say that actually, look, you can build these associations even when there isn't a pre-existing association without being aware of either stimuli. So what about the consciousness? What is this grand ability of ours, this conscious existence going to do for us in this paradigm? How much better are we if we do this consciously? Now this is much easier to explain because it's exactly the same as the linguistic cross-modal study, but now we just put them above threshold. So we make sure that they can hear the stimuli, so they can hear the names, and we present the pairs, and they can see the names, see the professions visually, and we present them. So essentially all we're doing here, what we did is, in fact, we kept the duration of exposure for the visual presentation to be the same as the average exposure in the subliminal case, but we used full contrast. So whereas previously we used low contrast, we actually used full contrast. It's about 150 milliseconds. Now, if you present things at 150 milliseconds but with very low contrast, people can't see it. Here, we're using full contrast, and 150 milliseconds is plenty to be able to see it. But what we're doing is confirming, in this case, that they can see and hear the stimuli. We check that they can, and then we go on to do exactly the same test phase as before, so concordant or discordant pairs. Now, slightly different exclusion, only in the sense that obviously we're not excluding people now if they identified the words, or if they, because obviously we need them to be able to identify the words and so on, so it's a conscious version, but otherwise exactly the same criteria applied. So what did consciousness buy us? Absolutely nothing. It wiped it out. Now, I'm not suggesting that this would be a significant difference, because these effects are quite small. We ended up with a 2 millisecond difference. It's in the same direction. But this is crazy. It seemed in this context that people were worse at this, which I really was very surprised at. I don't have a full explanation, but I at least have some indication of why this is happening. So looking closer at the data, what we find is two things. That essentially, they make many, many more errors. So when they're obviously hearing these pairs, and perhaps they're anticipating the visual presentation based on what they've heard, you would imagine they would quite quickly realize that there is no, in the test phase, there's no concordance, because obviously there's half the time they are concordant and half the time discordant. They don't make more errors when it's discordant than concordant, however. So that explanation seems weak. What we do know is they make very many more of them. And there was also, as a direct result, obviously, many more excluded trials. So our power to detect the effect was much reduced. So we have a significantly more errors being made, and obviously significantly more trials excluded, because they're being excluded based on when you make a response error. So this to some extent it limits the claims that we can make for the fact that this is not there, but it does, at least for me, it makes me feel a little bit comfortable that we didn't observe the effect here because they're doing the task very differently. They're clearly doing the task very differently if they're making considerably more errors in the process. So that was key. What can we conclude from this whole sequence of studies that went on for so very long? Well, we have demonstrated that unconscious associative learning, both within individual modalities and cross-modally, that can be achieved. Now that was obviously what we set out to do. It can be achieved even for novel stimuli without any intermodal relationships. So no pre-existing learned associations as we have between the visual representation of the word and the phonetic representation. Without any of that, we can still achieve it. And we found that this unconscious learning appears, at least, and I don't want to make too much of this point, appears to be, I would say that it's actually interfered with in a conscious context, rather than we're more effective, perhaps. We're more effective at this unconsciously in this very limited context. So, contrary to the global workspace theory, and the particular aspect of it, the global access hypothesis, so that's what consciousness is it's being globally accessible, globally available. Contrary to that particular aspect of global workspace theory, we seem to be able to build associations between disparate regions without it entering the global workspace in this model. So essentially, all those experiments gave us that little arrow just there. That was what it was all about. We're being able to show that this happens without things going into this global workspace. And obviously, it is gratifying that this sequence of just behavioural studies enables us to really test, and in this case, refute essential aspects of one of the theories of consciousness. And it is one of the most dominant. So that was quite exciting for us. Just leaves me to say thank you very much for listening, and thank you to my collaborators and funding. Thank you.
thank you very much for your wonderful lecture. I have a small question about data analysis. That when you make an exclusion of some data based on reaction time, you assume that the distributions of reaction times in case of concordant and discordant, or incongruent and incongruent cases are similar. But if actually in incongruent case the distribution will be, the standard deviation will be larger, then you will probably exclude more of that data with higher reaction time. And possibly that could explain the small difference that you have observed. So what do you think of it?
I think, well, one thing I would say is if the distributions were radically different, that would be evidence of associative learning. So damned if you do, damned if you don't. It doesn't really matter. If that was the case, then it in its own right would provide evidence that there is an association being learnt. But it's a good point. It's not something we've looked at. We just applied standard procedure in terms of reaction times.
Thank you.
You told that in conscious association test, you use the full contrast.
Yeah, in the conscious version, we use the full contrast, yes.
So we can't explain the difference by involving the consciousness in the process, because we're not just involving the consciousness, but also we raise the intensity of the stimulus. So
no, you're quite right. I mean, there's a limit to how we can do this, though, in the sense that what we wanted to do was at least hold as much constants between the two conditions as possible, and we decided it was more important to leave the duration of the stimulus as equal as possible than the contrast. So obviously, if we just presented the stimulus for a second, then people would say, well, you had much more processing time. So we wanted to, we took the average duration of exposure in that unconscious cross-modal condition, kept to that, and then just used full contrast. In the same sense as obviously the auditory stimulus, we just increase the volume. There's not much else we can do, but obviously in both cases you're quite right that the stimuli are more intense, there are stronger representations, but obviously we can't have consciousness without it being at that level. But your point stands, and it's quite right.
And also I have one more little question. You told that the unconscious learning were more effective, but I was interested how does the reaction time relate in conscious case and unconscious case?
Well, that's a good question, and off the top of my head, I can't tell you. My apologies. I should have done that comparison. I haven't done that comparison. There's difference between some of the experiments. So, for example, they're quite a lot shorter in the non-linguistic versus the linguistic unconscious one. But that's most likely because the classification task is much easier in terms of classifying as symmetrical versus asymmetrical. I'm sorry, I don't know off the top of my head the conscious versus unconscious linguistic one. Sorry.
I'm sorry, I will ask in Russian.
Or I will translate you.
Okay.
Okay.
Хотела уточнить, правильно ли я понимаю, что когда мы сочетаем, в сериях на научение мы сочетаем неосознаваемый прайм
When we conjunct unconscious prime with the conscious target,
эффект научения сильнее, чем если мы берем два осознаваемых канала и смотрим происходящее.
the effect of learning is larger than in comparison when we have two conscious primes and targets. So we have unconscious prime and then the target. The effect of learning is larger than we have conscious prime and conscious target.
That's in her research.
No, she is asking, is she correct about yours? Because she considers like something that is primed here and then the target and like.
It's. They don't. Yeah, no, but she doesn't know what the question is in English. I'm sorry, I can tell you. It was the question, as I understood it, was, were we showing that? Yeah, you do.
So sorry. The question is that whether in Francois' study the unconscious prime led to greater effects in learning when it was matched with unconscious target, rather than the case when it was matched both conscious prime and conscious target.
There is a little confusion there, because in all cases where they're unconscious, essentially both aspects, both parts of the association are unconscious. So the unconscious is always paired with an unconscious stimulus. So you've got two stimuli. It's not really a prime and a conscious stimuli. They're both unconscious. So the name is unconscious and the profession are unconscious. And what we see there is that pairing appeared to affect the subsequent classification responses more than when both the name and the profession were conscious. As I show from the number of errors being made, this is likely from a sort of, they're adopting a very different approach, and they're probably trying to second guess what these associations are meant to be and are making more errors as a result.
Можно еще вопрос вдогонку? Не смотрели ли вы продолжительность эффекта? То есть как долго вот сохраняется вот эта неосознанно выученная связь? После действия, то есть как долго?
The question is about the after effect. How long did you see how long this association stays? Have you ever had such kind of experiments that will trace it within some span of time and check whether it exists after some time?
No, I'm afraid. We very specifically designed the procedure such that we take advantage of very short-term effects. So that's why we do the pairing followed by a test trial, and then another pairing followed by another test trial, rather than the more typical approach of doing lots of pairings. Lots of interference occurs, of course, and then lots of test trials. So I suspect one of the reasons we managed to get reliable results is because of this very short time frame. We presented unconsciously, then there's the test trial immediately afterwards. I haven't myself looked at how long that lasts.
Thank you.
My question is, I think, is related to the previous one. Is it possible for the subject to forget the association during the test? I mean, if Mike has been associated with fire unconsciously, and then you present Mike associated with banter as a test trial, then you go to counteract the previous association and then actually infer the effect that you would like to find. Is it a possibility?
So the names, there are 32 names and there's 32 trials. So each name is only ever used once in any test trial. So you get the two pairs, so Mike, pianist, Paul, banker. And then you get a test trial which might be Mike, pianist. And so essentially every other time you'll hear a different name for the pairings. So I don't think that can account for any of the effects.
So there is one association and then one test?
Test trial. Another association, another test, that's right. Okay.
So you should global books just doesn't work.
I wouldn't like to throw it out.
No way.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't like to throw it out completely. Certainly I wouldn't want to be the one to go up against the many, many people who are deeply invested in the theory. I think this shows a weakness in it. And it's a lot harder to come up with a replacement theory than it is to find a failing. But I do think it is quite a big criticism of it, and a number of other theories which adopt the same global access hypothesis. But no, sadly, I don't come to you with a new and revised theory of consciousness. That is beyond me at this stage, I'm afraid. Спасибо.